row today. And my first encounter with him was through my son when we moved here in 1985. That is true. He was working for Young Life, and having a 14-year-old son moving is a very difficult experience. And thanks to Jeff, as a Young Life leader, Eric was able to trade baseball cards, go to movies. I just asked him yesterday what his memories were, and he said, well, Jeff would take us to kind of issue-type movies, and then we would discuss them, like Glory and Driving Miss Daisy and some of those old ones. So we are so grateful very personally for Jeff. Well, he also worked for Young Life for 29 years in various roles, and then he came to Western Sem in what year? 2012, and just retired this past June. He has a wife, Gretchen, and 2 grown children, and he still likes baseball cards and reading and writing. Those are the details he sent me. So let's open with a word of prayer, and then Jeff is going to take it away. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you for people like Frederick Buechner who take your word and help us to think about it in new ways. And we thank you for people like Jeff who take Frederick Buechner and help us to understand him better. We just thank you for the blessing of being here today, and we pray for all those who are also with us online. In your name we pray. Amen. So, Jeff.
I can't believe that, 1985. I thought you were going to say I was in high school with him. Not that I was his Young Life leader, my gosh. How'd that happen? Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you at Christ Memorial this morning. We live really close to here, so it was wonderful. I actually attended an adult education class online at my church, Third Reformed, and still got here with plenty of time to spare, so that's amazing. It's the first time I've ever done anything like that. I brought a few things with me. In the back, there's a table, and I have copies of this book, Reading Buechner, the book that I wrote that we're going to talk about today. I have them for $10, and I'm not trying to turn the church into a marketplace, and I hope that one of the pastors doesn't come in and flip over the table or anything like that. But if you would like a copy, this is a more affordable price than you can get anywhere else. You can't get it this inexpensively online, even at Amazon or any of those places. I also have a sign-up sheet there, if you would like, just to give me your name and email address, because I do a newsletter, and it comes out occasionally. So I'm not going to flood your email box, but once every couple of months, because I do write a lot of different things that get published in a lot of different places, and I try to put those together with my newsletter. For example, I have another book that I'm a part of coming out that Joel Skoontanis has done. Have you guys heard of him? Some of you? Have you, ma'am? Have you heard of him? That's his mother-in-law. And so it's a book where Joel has done paintings, and then there are people that have written meditations. There are 40 paintings of the Gospels and gospel scenes. And I'm one of the people that wrote meditations. And then I also edited the whole piece of I didn't edit the paintings. I edited the meditations. So that's going to be out by Christmas. And I write for the 12, the Reformed Journal blog regularly. And I write, this is kind of crazy, but I am regularly writing poetry, book reviews, and essays for U.S. Catholic magazine. I am not Catholic, but they like me. So anyway, that's just kind of like if you were interested in seeing how all these different things come together, the newsletter would be a way to do that. So that's back there, and I promise if you give me your name and email address, I will not sell it to anyone, nor will I put very much in your inbox, because it's dependent on me getting it done, which means that my goals of like every week turn into every month, and then it turns into every other month. So that's probably about the rhythm that'll be. So Frederick Buechner, how many of you are familiar with Frederick Buechner? Raise your hand. So wow, that's really great. I go a lot of places where nobody has ever heard of him, which is part of the deal, part of the dilemma for Frederick Buechner. I'm glad that so many of you have heard of him. I would say he is arguably the greatest spiritual writer of our times. I would say that if he's not at the very top of the list, he at least belongs on the spiritual writer Mount Rushmore. I don't know that there are plans to make one, but if there were, he should be on it, maybe with people like C.S. Lewis, Henry Nouwen, Anne Lamott. I don't know who else would be on it, but Buechner should be on it. He is the only ordained minister. Think about this for a second. He is the only ordained minister to ever be nominated for America's top 2 literary awards in fiction. For the National Book Award, he was a runner-up in 1972 with a book called Lion Country, and for the Pulitzer Prize. He was runner-up also for the Pulitzer Prize in 1981 for his book called Godric. He published 40 books over the course of a 70-year career. His first novel, A Long Day's Dying, was a bestseller in 1950. He was featured at that time in Time magazine and Newsweek and Life. I've been in the Buechner archives. I've seen these different articles. It's really funny. One of them was talking about the next great crop of American literary writers, and it featured 3 people: Frederick Buechner, Truman Capote, and Norman Mailer. Interesting that that's the company that he was keeping in 1950. His most recent books, A Crazy Holy Grace and The Remarkable Ordinary, were published in 2017. So imagine that career spanning from 1950 to 2017. His 1982 memoir called The Sacred Journey started what we call the spiritual memoir movement. Now there are hundreds of spiritual memoirs. He has a collection of daily readings called Listening to Your Life. It's a devotional book that thousands, tens of thousands of people have used. He has an online presence. John Kleinexel was just telling me he gets Buechner every day that comes to him. You get an email probably from the Buechner Center, but is also his online. Yeah, a meditation every day. That's through the work of the Buechner Center, of his son-in-law primarily, and as a result, they have hundreds of thousands of followers on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Yet for all of that, nobody had ever written an accessible guide and introduction to Buechner's work until I did. How about that? And I just live down the road from you guys. Come on, it's amazing. That's why in a sense, that's why I wrote this book, was there wasn't a book like it. And next week, I'm going to have Mark Hiskus come with me. You guys, I think, know Mark. He's been here many times. He's a teacher at Holland Christian. He assigns Buechner books to his Holland Christian students. We're going to do an interview next week, talk together about Buechner, and I imagine that he will, I'll tell this story next week about how I happened to write this book. But there are a lot of different ways into Buechner. As I just mentioned, all those different books that he's written, all the different paths. So I want to tell a story, and the story is found in my book. So I'm going to read a little of my book to you because, let's face it, I think it's pretty good. Okay, so I'm just joking. Laugh. I can't tell. You all have masks on. I can't tell if you're smiling or not when I say these things, but I always quote, Steve Vandermolen knows me well because we worked at the seminary together for many years. I always quote Dizzy Dean, the great baseball pitcher who said, "It ain't bragging if you can back it up." So, right? Okay. Let me read a little bit of this to you and tell you, this is from the introduction, and it's a true story. It's about how Frederick Buechner changed my life. So one July afternoon in 1985, we were just talking about 1985, a month before our wedding, my 24-year-old fiance suffered a massive stroke. I was house sitting in my hometown of Holland, Michigan. It's actually right over on 30th Street for Ron and Sonny Boovie, if any of you know them, minding both a house and a high school student whose parents were away for a week. My fiancée Gretchen had promised to make us dinner that evening. The high school student and I were both sacked out on his family room couches while Harry Carey droned on about the Cubs. When Gretchen came in from work, we barely moved except to give her a hard time about waking us up. A moment later, she called to me from the bathroom. I'm not sure why I got right up, given that we'd just been goofing around, but something in her voice gave me the idea that I should. I found her standing in the bathroom with a ribbon of drool dropping down from the left side of her mouth. A tick was starting spasms on the right side of her face. Something happened, she said. The hospital was only a couple of blocks away, and I hit 70 miles an hour, that's true, on a residential street getting there. Once there, I made one phone call. Before long, the entire emergency waiting area filled with concerned friends who came to sit with me. Gretchen had been taken into a treatment room, and the situation seemed bleak. I didn't know if she was going to live or die, and I had no idea what sort of person she would be if she survived. I wondered if we would still get married, and what that might be like if she didn't recover well. After a while, all the adrenaline that had fueled my mad rush to the hospital started to wear off. As I sat thinking about the question marks clouding our future, an overwhelming weight descended upon me, and I began to cry. I was sitting between two friends, both older than me, men I respected and admired. One of them put his hand on my shoulder. I was expecting some wise, soothing words of comfort and empathy. Instead, he offered this: get a hold of yourself. Don't do that. Don't cry. She needs you to be strong. You have to be strong. And in one way, he was right. She would need a lot of strength from me, more than I ever imagined I had. But in every other way, he was wrong. The best thing for me would have been to allow myself to feel what was happening. Instead, I did what he said. I pulled myself together. I stopped crying. I stopped feeling. I buried the pain. My friend gave bad advice, but he was simply saying what he thought was the right thing to do in that moment. I'm the one who took it. For months and years following that event, I hardly allowed myself to express any emotions. I was numb. Feelings were hard and risky and scary, and I still struggle with allowing myself to fully feel things. There was one emotion that occasionally erupted during those years: anger. It would flash out in unexpected ways, leaving only shame in its wake. 7 years later, I was in a bookstore and saw a new title from my favorite author, Frederick Buechner. I had become aware of Buechner right after college because my minister, who at that time was Bill Hilligans, in case I'd say that name for some of you would know him, was always quoting either him or Dietrich Bonhoeffer in sermons. I knew Bonhoeffer was, but not Buechner. I figured since Buechner had a German-sounding name, he must be a fellow World War II martyr, and I was wrong. When I started seminary, I was assigned the Buechner book, Telling the Truth, the Gospel as Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. It was like anything I'd read before. It was funny and wise and contemporary and timeless, and I devoured that book and learned that Frederick Buechner was very much alive and at the height of his powers as a writer. I started reading every Buechner book I could find and was delighted again and again. On this particular day in the bookstore, I saw The Clown in the Belfry, and I bought it. I was immediately drawn to an essay entitled Adolescence and the Stewardship of Pain. I was working, as Sherry said, I was working for Young Life. I was working in youth ministry at the time. The idea that Buechner had written about adolescence was intriguing. Stewardship, on the other hand, sounded about as exciting as mortgage amortization. It's not an overstatement to say that essay changed my life. Buechner invents a new etymology to suggest that adolescence means to grow toward pain. To be an adolescent on the way to becoming an adult is to experience pain in new and significant ways. Buechner describes the difference between childhood and adolescence. By and large, children do not seem to keep score. Adolescence, as I etymologize the term, starts when scorekeeping starts. So then Buechner plays with a parable that Jesus told in Matthew 25, where a man goes away and gives his servants talents to manage in his absence. And I've heard many sermons saying this parable is about managing money. But Buechner reframes it with the unexpected suggestion that it could be about pain. The most profound part of a very profound essay says, what the parable is essentially about, and the question the parable poses is, what do we do with these mixed lives that we're given? These hands were so unequally dealt. How do we get the most out of what we're so variously and richly and hair-raisingly given? The third servant takes what he is given. For our purposes, let us focus particularly on the pain he is given and buries it. He takes it and hides it in a hole in the ground, and thereby, I would suggest, becomes the blood brother and soulmate of virtually all of us at one time or another. I was afraid, is what the third servant says. And he had good reason to be. All of us have good reason to be afraid. So we dig the hole in the ground, in ourselves, in our busyness or wherever else we dig it, and hide the terrible things in it, which is another way of saying that we hide ourselves from the terrible things. I think that what the parable meant is that the buried pain in particular, and all the other things we tend to bury along with pain, including joy, which tends to get buried too when we start burying things, that the buried life itself is darkness and wailing and gnashing of teeth. And the one who casts us into it is no one other than ourselves. So burying pain is a way of surviving, but not a way to grow. Buechner notes, being alive to pain and somehow becoming a steward of it calls us to a deeper, fuller, more honest life, out of the shallows and into the depths. There's no guarantee that we'll find a pearl in the depths, that the end of our pain will have a happy end, or even any end at all, but at least we stand a chance of finding in those depths who we most deeply and humanly are. And as I read that, the tears that I had swallowed that night 7 years earlier came back. This was my story. How did Frederick Buechner, a writer and pastor living hundreds of miles away in Vermont, know so much about me? I cried for the first time since I'd pulled myself together that night 7 years earlier. And 7 years worth of tears is a lot of tears. Frederick Buechner had used some sort of X-ray vision to gaze into my soul and see my buried secret. In that emergency waiting room, I had taken my friend's suggestion to get a hold of myself as an invitation to bury my pain. The numbness that followed was like being cast into outer darkness. I knew I was stuck, but I didn't know how to get out. Buechner showed me the way out, the way to becoming fully alive again. I've told this story over the years to several groups of people, and after hearing it, people often respond by telling me their stories of loss and pain. One time after I told this story, a man followed me into a men's room to tell me about the death of his daughter. I've heard heartbreaking stories of depressed and diseased spouses, sick and dying children, brain tumors, leukemia, troubled marriages. Pain is universal. Giving ourselves permission to feel and acknowledge pain is liberating. Our stories of pain are among the most intimate gifts that we can offer each other. That is why stewardship, that word that didn't interest me at all, turns out to be such a meaningful Christian concept. To be a good steward is to ask oneself, what am I doing with what I've been given? With my pain, yes, but more than that, with my very life. Have I shared from my deepest experiences, somehow traded with them and improved on them? Or have I buried them and let fear and shame and ignorance control me? Something happened, Gretchen had said immediately after her stroke, but I wanted to pretend that nothing had happened. It didn't work. It never works. The path to healing, to wholeness, to salvation is always through the difficult and painful things, not around them. Buechner's words challenged me to bring my pain out and hold it up to the light, a quest I've been on ever since. While such a choice is hard and risky and scary, in my experience, it's the way you get your life back. So reading Buechner gave the fullness of my life back to me, which is why I say Frederick Buechner changed my life. So that's my story, a little bit of how of why this guy has come to mean so much to me. I just am curious, as I said that, as I read that piece, did any of those parts resonate with you? Were there things that you thought, well, that's true, I felt that, I know that? Go ahead and say some of those. I'll repeat them I guess there are people that are, hopefully there are people that are watching online, so if you say them, I'll repeat them. Rich told me to just repeat them. Just what are some things that rung true for you? Anything? You're nodding your heads yes, so I think there's got to be some things.
You talked about adolescence running towards pain.
Uh-huh.
And I've just been thinking a lot about the young people today in this pandemic time. And maybe you could speak a little bit more about that, how that is pain for a lot of them.
Yeah.
And how are they to deal with that?
So Sherry just said, I mentioned the adolescence. Buechner says that it's where we begin to keep score or recognize pain in our lives. And what does the present moment have to do with that, with young people? Well, we don't know yet, do we? But there is this sense that children often can experience horrible things, and yet they just kind of go on one day to another. And adolescence is the time when so many people that have experienced horrible things or feel different things, that they begin to live those out, that they begin to, those get played out. So that's where he's coming from in his sense of the etymology of that term. Anything else? Yeah, Ron. Yeah.
Don't let your emotions take a hold of you. Real people, real men, don't show pain.
Right. So Ron just said the American way is to be tough. That certainly the messages that we get about masculinity are to be tough, to not show your pain, not to break down crying at that time, which I did. That made the person next to me uncomfortable. But in his, I always say, he didn't make me do that. I did that. I chose the path that I went on. He was simply saying what he thought at the time. But yeah, that's true. One thing that I hope you pick up on, which is what Buechner is a master at, is this sense that what I found, I said, how did Frederick Buechner, a writer living in Vermont, know so much about me? Well, he doesn't know anything about me. He doesn't know me. But his ability as a writer to write about his own experience is something that in the book I call the universal particular. And what I mean by that is he tells his particular story. But what resonates with us is not so much the details of his particular story as the universal application of his particular story. So it's not so much, here's a guy who lived on the East Coast and lived in Vermont and was raised in this kind of family and experienced great pain, as much as here's what it means to be human. And here's what it means to try to follow God in the midst of being human. So it's that kind of universal application for us. And then to be able to say that it changed my life, I think we go to, we read, we watch movies, we different things that we take in. What we ultimately want is for something to change our lives. for something to move us. For a long time in the seminary, I worked in the world of fundraising. And in fundraising, we had a mantra. I'm sorry, I'm gonna clue you all into this, and then you're gonna start noticing it in all the fundraising appeals that you get. But we would say, people will give money for two reasons: because you are saving somebody's life or you are changing somebody's life. That is what motivates us to give. We want to give to things that we see change lives or save lives. And so for my experience with Buechner is to be able to say that he changed my life. And that's really, really significant. So there's a lot there, right? And that's just the introduction of the book. There's a lot to Buechner. Yeah, Sherry.
Were you able to ever tell him that?
I was, actually. I did tell him that story, yeah. And if you buy my book, it's there in the book, actually in the epilogue where I tell that story about being able to talk to him about it. I want to tell you a little bit about my book and how I have it organized, and then share a little bit. And what time are we supposed to be done? About 1 o'clock? 3? What time do I have?
11:30.
11:30. Okay, great. Which is feels to me like 12:30 for some reason. I don't know. This is the one day of the year that I feel rested. The rest of the year, never, but today's a good day. So I divided, what I did, the approach I took to this is, he has 40 books. And I would deal with seminary students all the time that would say, I've heard his name, but where do I start? How do I make my way through these 40 books? So what I did was I divided his 40 books into 4 different genres. Memoirs, which he's written 4 specific memoirs. Sherry has one of them right there. Telling Secrets is a great, great book. I might read something from that book in a second. You can hold it for right now. It's one of his 4 memoirs. He has 3 other books that have heavily memoirish elements to them. So memoirs, he wrote 18 novels. So the novels are another big section. The third genre that I said, which is kind of a word that I created, but I call it popular theology. He wrote theology, but he didn't write theology in the way that academic people write theology. He wrote theology for people like us to read and enjoy. And particularly, he wrote 3 different books that were all lexical in that they were all arranged alphabetically. And in 2 of them, he took words, theological words or even common words, and just wrote definitions of those. And then in another one of those books, he wrote about Bible characters. And he just goes from Aaron to Zacchaeus, I think, in that A to Z, doing those alphabetical things. And then the 4th section is on preaching, because he's published books of his sermons. He wrote a great book about the act of preaching itself. So he's widely read by lots of ministers, particularly his preaching and other things as well. So when I look at the memoirs, one of his most famous quotes is, "Listen to your life. See it for the fathomless mystery that it is, in the boredom and pain of it no less than in the excitement and gladness. Touch, taste, smell your way to the holy and hidden heart of it, because in the last analysis, all moments are key moments, and life itself is grace." So listen to your life. Pay attention to your life. Buechner says if God is active anywhere, he's active in our personal lives. The task for us is to pay attention. And so I'm gonna ask you for this. This is great, Sherry. We didn't plan this. This just happened, right? I want to read the first line of this book because it's so compelling. So Buechner's story is a compelling story. This is the first line of this book, Telling Secrets. One November morning in 1936, when I was 10 years old, my father got up early, put on a pair of gray slacks and a maroon sweater, opened the door to look in briefly on my younger brother and me, who were playing a game in our room, and then went down into the garage, where he turned on the engine of the family Chevy and sat down on the running board to wait for the exhaust to kill him. That gets your attention, right? So his father committed suicide when Buechner was 10 years old. And as he tells in the book, Telling Secrets, that became a family secret. They did not talk. His father's existence became a family secret. They didn't talk about his father after his suicide. There was no funeral. It was suicide. It was such a shameful thing that there was just no conversation about it. And in 1958, Buechner published a novel called The Return of Ansel Gibbs, which had a suicide in it, although not at all mirroring the same. Some of the details were the same as his father's, but the way that the person committed suicide was not at all the same. And Buechner said his mother's reaction was, the one word that would describe his mother's reaction was fury. She was absolutely furious that he had revealed the family secret. He was 32 years old at the time, and he said, I felt like I was 6. I was ashamed that I had told that secret. And so a big part of his life is coming to grips with his own father's suicide and the fact that it's a story that he had every right to tell. Its impact on him, he had every right to talk about that. And then that becomes one of those universal particular things as well. And so he also gets into very deeply a question of how, he says, God is active in our personal lives. God is active in our lives. So this creates a big question. How does that work? How is it that God is active in our lives? How do we see God acting in our lives, especially when terrible things happen in our lives? How is God active in those things? And I use in the book, I'm going to read another page. I use the example. Do you remember the movie Forrest Gump? Tom Hanks movie. Everybody's nodding. Pretty much everybody's seen that movie. I don't know if you ever noticed, but at the beginning of the movie, right, but before we meet Forrest and the whole story happens, we see a feather floating in the air, moving around. And at the end of the movie, actually, the feather is repeated. So I called chapter 2 of my book, Forrest Gump's Feather. And I get into that with this idea that the movie Forrest Gump begins and ends with the image of a feather floating in the air. The feather represents Forrest's light innocence as he moves from one late 20th century cultural marker to another. The feather also represents the movie's key question: who's right? Was it Forrest's mama who said our lives have a destiny? Or Lieutenant Dan, who said we're floating around accidentally, pushed by the wind? Is there a meaning in the randomness? Or are we just feathers floating around, drifting along in a series of disconnected events? Forrest splits the difference, saying that maybe both are right. This is when he's at his mama's graveside. He says this, I don't know, Mama, if you were right or Lieutenant Dan is right. He says, maybe you're both right, which I said is strong reasoning for someone with an IQ of 75. But the question about determinism or about God's will is one we keep asking. Well, Frederick Buechner believes that there is much more going on. He dares to believe that God is speaking and working, even in the seemingly random and mundane parts of life, or especially in the random and mundane parts of life. Most of the time we aren't paying attention and we miss it, but God is still speaking. The storyteller's claim, Buechner wrote in a book called The Magnificent Defeat, is that life has meaning, that the things that happen to people happen not just by accident, like leaves being blown off a tree by the wind, but that there is order and purpose deep down behind them or inside them, and that they're leading us not just anywhere, but somewhere. The power of stories is that they're telling us that life adds up somehow. That life itself is like a story. And as a novelist, Buechner was always looking for plot lines. And as surely as there's a plot line to Forrest Gump, our lives have a plot as well. Indeed, life itself has a plot. In another one of his sermons, he says it this way: the story of Adam is the story of each of us. We are created to serve God and each other in love, but each of us chooses instead to serve himself as God. Our lives have a similar plot as the Bible, that God creates, we get lost, and God works to bring us and the rest of creation back to himself. So if God is doing that, why is it not more obvious? That question animates much of Buechner's writing. And the title of his second memoir, which is Now and Then, which was published 1 year after The Sacred Journey in 1983, is an answer to that question. The title comes from the book's epigraph: here and there in the world, and now and then in ourselves, is a new creation, which is a quote from Paul Tillich, who was Buechner's professor of theology at Union Theological Seminary. Later he adds the words mostly hidden to that description, that here and there, now and then, mostly hidden. These phrases are bedrock pieces of Buechner's belief about God's activity in our world. Our task is to pay attention, to stop, look, listen for what God is doing. So this is territory that Buechner returns to over and over. Theologians speak of this. I'm going to give you a couple theological terms. You're going to hang in there with me on these, but I think you'll get them. As the tension between divine sovereignty and human freedom. All right? So divine sovereignty on one side, that's big for us, Reformed people, Calvinists, the sovereignty of God. And yet human freedom on the other side. We talk about free will. So we're talking about the tension that we feel between God's will and free will. When something happens, especially a terrible thing, the question is this God's will? Does God will the death of children? Does God will hurricanes? Does God will tornadoes? Did God will the suicide of Frederick Buechner's father? So, or are these things just the result of sin, the dark consequences of human freedom that exist in our world? So the point I make in the book is that most of us think of this as what we would call a zero-sum game or zero-sum equation, that the more God is active and working, the less human freedom is, or the more human freedom we have, the less God is able to work. So we see these things like a giant seesaw. If one end is up, the other one must be down. But there are inherent problems with this. If God is orchestrating all the action, what's that make us? Well, it makes us puppets, right? We actually don't have freedom. We don't have a will to decide things. And it also makes God into a pretty tough to love character because then God is willing actively every sin that happens, every tragedy that happens. But if you take human freedom and elevate that, then God no longer is God. God's hands are tied. God's as surprised as any of us on the way things unfold. So this is a tension that has occupied philosophers and theologians for centuries. It's one of those areas that there is no answer. There is no satisfactory answer. If there was a satisfactory answer, we would already all know it, okay? It would all be apparent to us, oh, it's just this. There is no answer. And lest this just seem philosophical and esoteric, it has a lot of implications for us. For example, why would you pray? Why would you pray an intercessory prayer if everything's already determined? What's the point of prayer then? Another way it plays itself out is, and on Reformation Sunday of all days, this is a great day to talk about this, what role do humans play in their own salvation? Is it all just God's acting, or is there some part that humans have to play? Well, that's been something, that's what a big part of the Reformation was about, that there were great abuses on the one side, which was selling indulgences. You know, you've heard of those things, that here's how you get to heaven, you buy it, right? Well, no, we're saved by grace through faith, which is a gift of God in itself. So there's a lot of tension there, a lot of things that are unresolved, but it's territory that Buechner, as a memoirist especially, has waded into again and again and again. By insisting that life has a plot and that we discover the plot of our lives as we pay attention, as we listen to our lives. Buechner is saying God is alive and active and is working. That if God speaks anywhere, it's into our personal lives. He doesn't solve all the theological and philosophical problems that are inherent in this conversation. Instead, he approaches it ultimately with a pastor's heart instead of a philosophical heart. Buechner lands on, instead of solving the problem one side or the other, he simply lands in the middle, I would say, on presence. And he said, the thing that matters is not the answer on one side or the other. The thing that matters is presence, God's presence. And he has good scriptural basis that he's standing on when he says this. When you think about the book of Job, and Job raising all of his questions about the terrible tragedy that has happened, what is the answer that Job is given ultimately? Well, God reveals himself. God makes himself present. God never answers Job's questions per se. God never says, here's the philosophical, theological rationale for everything that happens. God just is. He is present. And his presence makes the questions dissolve. 2 points related to that. The first is, that's why when people are suffering, when tragedy happens, what do we want? We don't want somebody to come in and say, you know, this was God's will. Or say, this was not God's will. We don't want that. We just want people to come in and empathize with us, right? To get into it with us, to feel it with us. And I think the other point would be, Buechner's sense is, even in his father's suicide, was he couldn't make sense of it in theological terms, but the sense he made of it was that even in this dark, dark moment, God never abandoned my father, that God was still present with him. And it makes me think of, I'm a great fan of Corrie ten Boom. We used to live in the Netherlands. One of my Young Life, we were, all those different years I worked for Young Life, one of the places I worked for Young Life was in Europe for a couple of years, and we lived in the Netherlands. And we went to the Corrie ten Boom's house in Haarlem. How many of you guys have been? Some of you have been there. 3 of you have been there. Cool. How many of you have been to Anne Frank's house in Amsterdam? See, many more of you have been to Anne Frank's house, but you got to go to Corrie ten Boom's house too. See the hiding place. You remember her whole story and all that? Well, when she was in the concentration camp with her sister Betsy, and Betsy was a person of tremendous faith, as was Corrie. But Betsy knew that she wasn't going to survive. She told Corrie, you have to live, and you have to tell people that there's no hole so deep that God's love isn't deeper still. That there's no place so dark that God's light can't shine. And so that's what I think of as that sense of presence. And that's the pastoral answer. The answer is not that I know the solution to this philosophical conundrum. The answer is simply that I'm here, that God is here, that God has never left us, that God never deserts us. So one of Buechner's great stories, one of my favorites, is I mentioned how he went through a long process of coming to grips with his father's suicide, but also as he was an adult, he had he and his wife had 3 children, 3 daughters. His oldest daughter had a really difficult transition from adolescence into adulthood, and she developed a drinking problem, and then she developed an eating disorder, and she became had anorexia. And she eventually wound up being hospitalized and they had to get a court order to get a feeding tube inserted into her that saved her life. Now, this daughter today is a pastor. It's kind of amazing. She's turned her life around greatly. But in those dark days, which were in the late 1970s, Buechner realized she was hospitalized in Seattle. He and his wife lived in Vermont. He said that in a sense, he was a part of the problem with what was going on with her. And as much as he wanted to solve her problem, fix her problem, he couldn't do that. And she had to be hospitalized and put in a place that was so far away from where he was. And he writes about in the midst of that time, he was one day driving his car close to his home, and he just was overcome with emotion, overcome with feeling, and he started to cry, and he realized, he was starting to sob, and so he realized, I can't drive my car, and he pulled over off the side of the road and just sat there sobbing, and a car came by, and the guy saw him, and the guy stopped and asked if he was okay, and Buechner said he was okay, and the guy got in his car and started to drive away, and as he drove away, Buechner saw that the guy had a personalized license plate, and spelled out on the license plate were the letters T-R-U-S-T, trust. Buechner said, of all the words in the world that I most needed to hear, that was it. That was the word. And the punchline to this story is that Buechner wrote that, put that in a book. The guy who had the car showed up at his house. The guy with the license plate showed up at Buechner's house one day because he'd read about it in Buechner's book. And he had the license plate, and he gave it to Buechner. And he said, by the way, I'm a trust officer at a bank. But Buechner said he still has the license plate. Buechner's still alive, by the way. He's 94 years old. And he put it on a shelf in his library, and he said, it's the holiest relic that I have. Because, see, this is his point, too, is how God works, right? I'm a trust officer in a bank, but that doesn't matter. That was the word. It was the word for Buechner. It was God's message, and that's what he means by paying attention, to listen to our life, to see the ways that God moves and acts in our lives. So, I love that story. I mentioned he has 18 novels. I highlight a couple of them in my book. I mentioned that he does theology, popular theology. I want to read a couple of those things. Then I want to tell a story about him as a preacher. And then I'll be done, and we can ask questions or talk a little bit, and then we'll get into it more next week. But first thing I want to say is this is just for Steve and John, okay? Graduates, anybody else here a graduate of Western Theological Seminary? Wow, there's more. I don't know you. Norma. All right, Norma, this is for you also. This is Buechner's definition of theology. I mentioned that he has these books, these ABC books, where he writes very pithy definitions of things. So in one of them, he has this definition of theology. Theology is the study of God and his ways. For all we know, dung beetles may study us in our ways and call it humanology. If so, we would probably be more touched and amused than irritated. One hopes that God feels likewise. Isn't that perfect? I think it is, having lived among theologians for several years. So he has all these pithy statements. I'm just going to read some of them to you because I love them. Lust, his definition of lust. Lust is the craving for salt of a person who is dying of thirst. And then on calling, and this has become a very, very famous Buechner quote. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Isn't that beautiful? The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. John, that's a very lovely ringtone that you have. It was punctuated, that last statement. Nice. Doubt. Doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep it awake and moving. And see, he would pick up on, I mentioned Paul Tillich was his professor of theology. Tillich would always say, doubt is never the opposite of faith. Doubt is a part of the life of faith. Envy, and then so you'd say, so then what is the opposite of faith? Fear would be the answer. Fear is the opposite of faith. Envy is the consuming desire to have everyone else as unsuccessful as you are. And then I love this one. It is as impossible for us to demonstrate the existence of God as it would be for for Sherlock Holmes to demonstrate the existence of Arthur Conan Doyle. Okay? Do you get that? So Arthur Conan Doyle is the guy that wrote the Sherlock Holmes book. It's as impossible for us to prove the existence of God as it would be for Sherlock Holmes, the great detective, to prove the existence of Arthur Conan Doyle. Love that. So last story I'm going to tell is about Buechner as a preacher. He is a great preacher. He's obviously, I think you would get, obviously, he's a highly literate preacher. He's very, very compelling. And he's published several books of his sermons. His first job, and really only ministry job he had after he went to seminary, and next week when we talk with Mark, I'll tell the whole story. He was converted as an adult. He converted after his first couple of books had been published. He was not, his family never went to church, so we'll talk about that more next week. But then he went to seminary, and after he graduated from seminary, he got a job as a school minister and English teacher at the Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire. It's a very elite private boarding school. At that time was all young men. This is the late 50s and early 60s. And several of his students were either from very prominent families or became prominent people. One of his students was the novelist, or is the novelist John Irving, if you've heard of him. And John Irving, actually, one of his books, a very religious book that John Irving wrote. A lot of John Irving stuff is very far from being religious, but a very religious book that John Irving wrote, A Prayer for Owen Meany. In the introduction to that book, he cites his debt of gratitude to Frederick Buechner as his mentor. Another one of his students at Phillips Exeter was David Eisenhower, who was the grandson of Dwight Eisenhower and is the person that married Richard Nixon's daughter. You remember Julie Nixon Eisenhower. And so while Eisenhower came to Exeter while Buechner was working there, did one of their commencement speeches. But Buechner, as a preacher, he had these students, they had to go to chapel. It was forced chapel. None of them wanted to go to chapel, or if any of them did, it was 1 or 2% that wanted to go to chapel. And they all identified themselves, and you think about this, especially the early 1960s, they identified themselves as negos. They were negative, they said, negative about everything, negative about the government, negative about the U.S.'s growing involvement in Vietnam, negative about the state of civil rights. They were very much on the side of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. Negative about the school's administration, negative about any authority figures, negative about the school minister that stood up there and preached in chapel, negative about everything. So imagine this, especially those of you that have preached, imagine an audience of 16, 17, 18-year-old boys who don't want to be there and are not only don't want to be there, but that are actively angry about being there and negative. And that's your audience. That's who you're going to preach to. And so if you want to become a great preacher, preach to an audience like that and try to figure out how you get their attention. But what Buechner said, and what has made him a great preacher, is that he imagined every time he stepped in front of those students, and then since then, every time in his life preaching, that every single person had a simple 3-word question tattooed on their forehead. And the question was, is it true? With a question mark. Is it true? Could what this person is claiming to be true possibly be true? This story about Jesus, about his life, his death, his resurrection, this story about a God that loves us, these stories that are told throughout the Bible. Is it true? Could it possibly be true? And so all of his sermons begin with this idea in mind, that he's always writing for the people that have questions, the people that have doubts, the people that aren't sure. And as a result, his sermons have that kind of beautiful application for us. So those are the stories I wanted to tell today. I told Rich and Sherry, they said, are you going to have technology and stuff? And I said, no, I'm just going to come tell you guys some stories. So those are the stories I wanted to tell today. I still have 2 minutes in case anybody wants to ask me a question. If not, I can just say you can grab a book, and if you don't have $10 today, bring $10 next week, and sign up for my newsletter as well. So,
I have one question.
Okay, Sherry.
Coming so lately to Buechner. Our kids do. You don't have an on. I think you have to turn it on. A little bit on. Press it. Is it on? Not on.
I can repeat it, Sherry.
Okay.
Oh, you got it.
I got it.
There you go.
I just wonder if high school, college students today are being exposed to Buechner.
Only by people like us that make it happen. Well, I said that there's a pretty big online presence, so it's available. But yes, I mean, that's one of the reasons I wrote my book, is to say to the next generation. I was thinking of seminary students, but there's so many of them that have heard the name but don't know exactly who he is or where to start. And we'll do more next week with kind of more of his story, who he is, and the stuff that he's written. So,
Anybody have a question that could be repeated? Or?
Well, thank you all for letting me be here with you. I noticed that it's no longer fall; it is winter today. So, wow, what a day! But thank you all. Can I say a prayer? Is that okay? Is that allowed?
Yes.
Let me say a prayer. I don't know the rules here at Christ Memorial, but Steve, is that okay? All right, good. Let's pray together. Lord, we do thank you for your servant, Frederick Buechner, for the marvelous gifts that you gave him, and for the ways that you worked in his life, and for the ways that his words speak to the rest of us. May we be able to know your presence among us, to rest in your grace and love today and through all our days. Keep us safe as we go from this place. In your son's name we pray. Amen. Thank you all. Grab a book, sign up for my email newsletter if you'd like.